if you can see my slides, you also have access to the slides on the Google Drive. I'll get started. Okay, uh, a quick tour of various study designs that we use in epidemiology. Okay, so last class, I spent a lot of time explaining to you that the central purpose of epi research is causality. Okay, we're constantly asking, is something called an exposure, whatever that might be, could be a drug, could be a vaccine, could be a behavioral trait, could be an environmental exposure, right? Is that exposure in some way causally connected to an outcome? The outcome could be anything, could be disease, could be a health state, could be a behavior, could be anything, okay? It's interesting that what is sometimes an exposure variable in one study could well be an outcome variable in another study. Okay, it really does not matter. It is up to a researcher to clearly delineate what they consider an exposure in their study and what they consider an outcome in their study. Okay, the researcher gets to decide what the central hypothesis they are studying. Okay, and then along with the exposure and the outcome, which both need to be measured, and you will learn more about how to measure them in a second, we also have to consider a whole bunch of other variables that we call covariates. Covariates, which means it varies with the primary measurement. Okay. For example, we never would study age, for example, without studying sex, right? Sex is a covariate that we always consider because we wonder sometimes whether the exposure and outcome association is different for men versus women. So if you want to do sex disaggregated analysis, then you must measure sex as a covariate, right? Same thing goes for socioeconomic status. Or if you are working in some countries, race is a very, very important covariate, right? If I were doing research in the United States or South Africa and I don't measure race, I've already lost the plot, okay? Because so many things differ by race, and by not measuring it and accounting for it, I am kind of painting it with the broad stroke brush and I'm losing all the nuance in my research. So that's basically the fundamental architecture of how we think about measuring exposure, outcomes, and covariates. We measure all of them together, then we will analyze them in our data analysis, okay? The best study design, so we have some hierarchy of what we think is a more superior study design versus a weaker study design. But to be honest, the best study design needs to be tailored to the research question. Some questions inherently push you towards a certain design, and other questions, you could use one or you could use the other. And often the decision to use one study design over the other is a factor of how much money do we have, how much time do we have, and resources, and so on and so forth. Okay, but the best epi study design is one that will capture the causal effect of interest with the minimal distortion. Okay, a good study design will have thought through all of these problems that can deviate you away from the true causal effect. Now, this handout is really important. It is already in your Google Drive. This is the way I think of study designs. I'm not saying universally everybody in the world sees it this way, but broadly, most people think of it this way. I kind of have the first level break. I break study designs into two big buckets. One I call descriptive studies. The goal of descriptive studies are not to get at any causality, but to merely describe the epidemiology of something. Okay. And a ton of descriptive studies are happening during this COVID epidemic, right? For example, a seroprevalence survey, what proportion of residents of Mumbai have antibodies to SARS-CoV virus is an example of a descriptive study. We're not trying to address a causality issue here. We merely want to know how many people in a population are infected. Okay, case series are descriptive studies. Here is a series of 18 people in our ICU. This many men, this many women, this many lived, this many died, this many were on ventilators, so on and so forth. Surveillance data. Anytime you see a surveillance report, We did 10,000 COVID tests in India today, right? As compared to 9,000 tests that were done yesterday. These are all simple descriptive numbers, and there's a valid use for them, and we always need them in an epidemiological context, right? We always begin with descriptive epi. Then we go to the next bucket of studies called analytical epi. Analytical epi is all about quantifying associations. Now you're saying, okay, we've described the disease. Who is more likely to be antibody positive? Older person or younger person? Someone who's in a contact or not a contact? Someone who's living in this region versus that region? The minute you start making comparative statements, then you are now in the realm of analytical epi. Okay? Analytical epi broadly then is grouped into two massive buckets: experimental studies, observational study. Okay? Experimental studies or non-experimental studies, right? Experimental studies, the most fundamental way to consider an experimental study is the researcher is actually experimenting on people, right? It's a human experiment, which means there has to be a tremendous amount of ethical scrutiny to allow that in the first place. And with all the necessary ethics approval and informed consent, we are actually giving people something, a drug, okay, an invasive test, or a vaccine, right? So the whole realm of new therapies or vaccines squarely forms into the experimental design situation, okay? So every randomized control trial you ever read is an experiment, okay? A randomized trial is a human experiment, right? Now, observational studies, we researchers do not give someone a drug or a vaccine. We merely study the population, and then we try and discern what is associated with what. Okay? Experiment, researcher intervenes. Observational study, we merely observe. We do not intervene, right? In general, experimental and observational studies can be thought of in that simplistic manner. If a researcher intervenes, then it's an experiment. Okay. Within experimental studies, there are uncontrolled trials, controlled trials, and within controlled trials, there is a randomized control trial, quasi-randomized control trial, and non-randomized control trial. Okay. I will tackle that a few slides down the line. Okay. Under non-experimental or observational studies, the bigger study designs are cohort studies, case control studies, cross-sectional surveys, ecological studies, and a bunch of hybrid designs that I've listed there. Okay, this is like the big picture handout on how studies break down, right? Each design, I could pretty much teach an entire semester long course on each design. And I have done so, right? For example, I've taught a whole one semester course on meta-analysis. That's a unique design that requires a lot of thinking, time and effort, software, papers, methodological issues. I've taken an entire course on randomized trial. I've taken an entire course on case control studies, okay? We kind of dive very deep into each design. If you were to do epidemiology, that's what you would do. Now, here is my first set of what I call experimental designs. Okay, there are uncontrolled trials and there are controlled trials. What does the word control mean? So if I gave a bunch of COVID patients hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir or azithromycin or whatever, and then I say a certain proportion got better, a certain proportion lived, certain proportion died, by itself, that information is helpful, but it does not get at the causal question on whether the improvement I saw or lack of improvement I saw was attributable to that specific drug or intervention. Okay? Because even with no drug or treatment, some people will still get better. Okay? There is a natural history of the disease which will happen even if somebody is completely untreated. In fact, without treatment, people will self-cure themselves of tuberculosis. That used to happen in the sanatorium days, right? Some people will just self-cure. Without treatment, leprosy can get better, right? Without treatment, diarrheal diseases often disappear. All of us have had food poisoning and diarrhea. We've not treated it often, and we get better after 3-4 days, right? So you cannot attribute that it's a drug that improved the situation without having an untreated group or a treat group that received placebo or a group that received standard of care, right? Some other drug or some other treatment. But then you should ask me, why on earth do people still have uncontrolled trials? The answer is you start off with a phase one trial. A phase one trial is primarily for safety. We gave remdesivir to 30 patients and we want to know if they're not dying, right? If not terrible things are not happening, that it's safe enough to give. We see some improvements in some metabolic parameters or the virus levels and so on and so forth. So uncontrolled trials are fine. They are often only phase one, at best phase 2A. Then you have to switch to controlled trials. Controlled clinical trials means you're already likely to be in phase three. Okay. Phase three is when you randomize people to treatment versus placebo, treatment A to treatment B, treatment A, B, C, D at the same time. All of those are controlled clinical trials. Okay, I hope you now understand. An uncontrolled trial has no comparator group. Everybody gets the drug or a vaccine. Controlled clinical trial is when you're setting up a causal comparison between treatment A and treatment B. Then within that, there is nuances on how you randomize. I'll tackle that when we speak about RCTs next week. Here is an example of an uncontrolled trial. Compassionate use of remdesivir for patients with severe COVID, published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of weeks ago. Okay, they took a bunch of people, 61 patients, who received at least one dose of remdesivir, and then of them, only 53 patients they could actually analyze. And then they told us how many lived, how many died, how many were on ventilators, how many improved on oxygen support, so on and so forth. If you really think about it, this is a pure descriptive study, okay? Except that it is done in a trial setting and it has no comparison group. So there is no group here that received a placebo. So you cannot quite tell whether this was remdesivir working or whether this is just the natural history of COVID with other supportive therapies that people are getting in the hospital, right? That's why many people were puzzled on why on earth New England Journal would publish a paper like this, because it doesn't quite tell you if remdesivir is working or not. But Gilead, the company, paid for the study. New England Journal probably wanted clicks. And so this is a whole industry journal complex that puts out papers like this. For what it's worth, at least it's telling us nothing terrible is happening to these people, but we still have to wait for controlled clinical trials on remdesivir. Okay, at best, see this as a phase one trial. Okay. Here is the same situation for COVID, hydroxychloroquine, but an actual controlled clinical trial. Okay. Now, this was also published a week or two ago in the BMJ, hydroxychloroquine in patients with mild to moderate COVID-19, an open label randomized controlled trial. So when the word randomized control clinical trial appears in the title, then you know you are in the realm of controlled clinical trials. There is a control group. Okay. So again, here they randomly allocated 150 patients, 75 to the standard of care, 75 to standard of care plus hydroxychloroquine, and then they tracked people over time to see whether they're clearing the virus or not, the COVID test becomes negative or not, how many lived, how many died, so on and so forth. Okay, I will dissect the results of this trial in the next lecture today. Now, most randomized controlled clinical trials are what we call a simple two-arm parallel design. Two-arm parallel RCT. This is a classic two-arm parallel RCT. Chloroquine against a comparator, two arms, parallel. It's all happening at the same time, right? You randomly allocate people to this or that. The trial is done at the same time. There is no crossing over. Everybody stays in whichever group they were allocated to, okay? Simple two-arm parallel RCT, right? There is something more nuanced called a crossover randomized control trial, right? This is particularly helpful when you're dealing with conditions which are like chronic over a period of time. For example, let's say you have chronic rheumatoid arthritis. You could give someone a new drug and compare it to a placebo for, say, 3 weeks. Then you take a week break. You allow the drug to be washed away from your metabolic system. And then you flip them to get the other treatment to those who didn't get it before. So this is called crossing over, because a group that began in the treatment arm could now be in the placebo arm. And those who began in the placebo arm could now be in the treatment arm. This trial design is beautiful because the same individual has an opportunity to be their own control, right? During the first 3 weeks, I got a new drug for rheumatoid arthritis. During the second 3 week period, I got placebo. And if both were done blinded, I didn't know which I got when. And then you measured my pain levels or whatever. You have a very nice opportunity to check whether I felt better when I was on this versus that. And the powerfulness of this goes back to the counterfactual issue that we spoke about last class. Counterfactual reality is, if I didn't get the new drug, how would I have felt? What would my outcomes have been? As opposed to, I did get the drug, what are my outcomes now? Any situation when the same human being can be treated and be a control is powerful, because it gets us closer to that gold standard counterfactual comparison that we love to see. So in fact, this is one of the only real situations where we are attempting to get at that counterfactual reality. Okay, we'll learn more about that next in the RCT lecture on Monday. Okay, now observational study designs. Okay, cohort, case control, cross-sectional, ecological, diagnostic accuracy studies. You will learn more about each of them next week. But for now, here is a quick tour. Right, in a cohort study, we don't intervene. Okay, we don't give drugs. We don't make people smoke. We don't tell them to exercise. We just follow up people to see what happens to people who had naturally selected themselves into group A versus naturally selected themselves into group B. Okay, for example, you take a cohort, a group of people, and I'll define a cohort soon. Cohort is a group of people that have a shared characteristic, right? For example, I could go and say, okay, I'm going to recruit everybody who's working in some industry. Okay, and I'm going to see who was exposed to asbestos by working in that industry versus who was not exposed to asbestos. So we didn't decide who's going to get exposed to asbestos. It has already happened, right? By naturally working in various occupations within the industry, some people were more exposed to dust than others. So you measure the exposure level to asbestos in some way, and you just follow them over time. Let's say you follow them up for 3 years, right? As and when new diseases of, say, asbestos-related lung disease occur, say cancer, mesothelioma, for example, is linked to asbestosis, okay? So you look for new cases of mesothelioma that happen, and that's what it says, D, D, D. New diseases are popping up as you follow up over time, right? And over time, the cohort will get smaller because people will die, people will leave the industry, people will develop the disease and never come back. You have to measure all of that. But once you've done that, you get incidence of mesothelioma in the asbestos exposed people as opposed to unexposed people. You will then compute the ratio of the two. You will get something called a risk ratio or a relative risk. And if that risk ratio is large and statistically significant, then we'll say, okay, maybe mesothelioma is risk factor for mesothelioma is asbestos exposure. Okay, so RCTs also follow up people over time. Cohort also follow up people over time. The difference is the exposure is artificially assigned in an RCT by us, by the investigators. In a cohort study, nobody assigns the exposure. We merely ascertain the exposure that has already happened in a cohort. Okay, here is an example of a cohort study on COVID. Clinical course and risk factors for mortality of adult inpatients with COVID-19 in Wuhan, China. Okay, a retrospective cohort study. This prospective versus retrospective cohort study, I will explain better when we do the cohort study lecture next week. But for now, try and understand all these folks have done is found 191 patients with COVID-19 from Wuhan, and then they followed them over time to see what on earth happened to them. Okay. Of the 191, 137 were discharged, 54 died. Multivariable regression shows that your risk of dying is higher if you had this versus that, older age versus younger age, right? This is what a cohort study really does well. Quantify the incidence of the outcome, death, recovery, whatever the outcome is, and then do an analysis to say who is more likely to recover versus die, various risk factors, various stratified analysis, men versus women. You could adjust for confounding, and then this gives you some sense of what is the likely risk factors that will result in a better outcome versus a bad outcome if you had COVID-19. Okay, classic cohort study. All right. Case control study is yet another design where now we don't take exposed people and follow them up over time. Instead, we take people in whom the outcome has already occurred. In some ways, this is like cheating, right? Because a cohort study really takes time to follow up. Okay. You can't do a cohort study easily. You have to recruit people, measure the exposure, and then wait for disease events to happen. But it's easy to find people who already have disease. Okay. So you can already go to a hospital, get people with mesothelioma. Okay. That's possible. You go to a cancer hospital, you'll find them easily. So you can then ask the mesothelioma patient, okay, so you have this disease. Did you work in an asbestosis factory? Were you exposed in the past? Right? We begin with the disease status, yes or no. That's why we call case versus control. And then we look back through records or through interview to see whether they had exposure in the past. And using this design, we are able to compute something called an odds ratio. Odds of being exposed if you were a case divided by odds of being exposed if you were a control, right? If you do this right, and it's not easy to do it right, lots of potential minefields in a case control study. But if you do it well, you could get the same information that you could get from a well done cohort study. Okay. So a case control study, if methodologically done well, can almost surely approximate what you might get in a cohort study, but it's much cheaper to do, much easier to use, much more time efficient because both the exposure and the disease have already happened. Okay. Here is an example of a case control study on COVID. Maternal and neonatal outcomes of pregnant women with COVID pneumonia, a case control study. Who are the cases? Pregnant women who were COVID positive, lab confirmed COVID positive pregnant women, compared to pregnant women in the same hospital without COVID-19. Okay, so you're taking pregnant women with COVID, comparing them to pregnant women without COVID, and you want to see what their differential status is. Okay, it's a case control comparison, and that's how they were looking at this particular study. Now, a cross-sectional study is a relatively weak design. It is perfectly fine to do a cross-sectional study if you really want to get at descriptive epidemiology, right? For example, the Santa Clara County study, and I'm going to give you an example now, right? Seroprevalence of COVID-19 antibodies in Santa Clara County in California, okay? So on 2 days, April 3rd and 4th of this year, they tested something like 3,000 plus patients, people in Santa Clara County, recruited using Facebook ads, and then they came to a drive-by center. They got the blood test done, and then you say what proportion of these Santa Clara County residents were positive on COVID-19 antibodies. Okay, the goal here is to really get at the prevalence. There is really no causal question here. It cannot address causal questions. And the exposure, outcome, covariates are all collected at the same time. There is no longitudinal follow-up. You don't know when it is that they became antibody positive. You're not repeating the blood test on the same people again and again and again. In fact, if you went back and repeated the antibody tests on them again and again, say 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, then it becomes a cohort design. A cross-sectional means you're taking one slice in time of a given population and you're measuring exposure, disease status at the same time. A cohort study inherently is multiple measurements, right? One at baseline, at a minimum, and one after a certain time period. So time sequencing of who gets what when is beautifully revealed in a cohort study. It's impossible to get time sequencing correct in a cross-sectional study. You never know who got what when in a cross-sectional study. Okay, that's one of the biggest limitations. That's why we would never use it for causality, because for causality, temporality is critical, right? Cause must precede the effect. And that you can never quite tell in a cross-sectional study. But it's perfectly fine if all you want is descriptive epidemiology and prevalence. Ecological studies, we already discussed that last class broadly. Here, you're not dealing with individual people. You're dealing with aggregate units. Unit could be a district. Unit could be a county. Unit could be a country. You take country level aggregate data, and then you try and see if there's any correlation between an exposure and an outcome. Okay? This is not based on individual level research. It's aggregate data. That's why it's called ecologic. It's at a zoomed out level, and it does not quite manage to tackle problems like confounding, which can happen at the individual level. Okay. And I'll be giving you a whole lecture on ecological studies later, but here's an example. BCG policies in various countries. Do countries give BCG at birth or not? Right? And what is their COVID death rate? Okay, so you take all countries, you line them up on an Excel spreadsheet. You get the COVID death rate in one column, BCG given at birth or not, yes or no. Okay, you get it on the second column. You run a correlation regression. You can throw a plot like this, right? That countries that give BCG seem to have a lower level of COVID deaths than countries like Italy, US, Belgium, Netherlands, which do not give BCG at birth. Okay, this is the kind of ecological comparisons which a lot of the media has taken and hyped, thinking that ecological correlation somehow will also be true at the individual level, and they are not. They can be, they don't have to be. Okay, at best, ecological studies are great for just throwing up an intriguing hypothesis. That's what this has done. And it's fine to chase the hypothesis, but we need to now do individual studies can do a better job of addressing problems like confounding. For example, countries that give BCG are much poorer than countries that stop giving BCG. Why did countries stop giving BCG? Because TB had disappeared. And TB disappears when countries become wealthier. It's as simple as that, right? And wealthier countries differ from poorer countries in terms of their ability to test for COVID, in terms of their age structure. There's 500 things that are different between these countries. And these sorts of ecological correlations simply cannot capture that nuance. So you need to go beyond ecologic studies if you're serious about causality. Okay, here is a similar example. This is also getting needlessly hyped up in the media. Vitamin D and ecological studies on vitamin D mean vitamin D levels per country against the COVID rate, and you say, oh, they're inversely correlated, right? The lower the vitamin D level, the higher the COVID morbidity and mortality. Therefore, vitamin D is a good thing. Let's all start giving vitamin D to our people, right? Again, that's overreach. Simply does not mean this is happening at the individual level. At best, it's throwing an hypothesis. And then the next design and the last one we'll talk about is diagnostic accuracy studies. The goal is to estimate how good or accurate a new test is compared to the true disease status, which we often get from something called the gold standard. Okay, so test is on one side of this 2x2 table. True disease status is at the top, right? You need a population with suspected COVID, for example. Everybody gets the new test and everybody gets the gold standard. And then you cross-classify people into 4 cells, true positives, false negatives, and true negative. And if you crunch the numbers, you can compute estimates called sensitivity of a test, specificity of a test, positive predictive value of a test, negative predictive value of a test. Okay. Everything can be computed from this simple 2 by 2 table. Okay. Lots of interesting diagnostic accuracy studies are being published for COVID right now. Here is an example: molecular test using a highly sensitive and specific real-time PCR validated in clinical specimens. Okay, tons of these studies are now coming out. My team works a lot with diagnostics, so this is bread and butter for us. We constantly look at diagnostic accuracy studies. Again, you will have a whole lecture on this particular study design next week. Okay. Right now, I'm giving you a quick tour. So don't get worried that you're not understanding everything. I promise you it'll become clearer. You have to wait for these 2 full weeks to settle in your head before you start understanding epidemiology. Okay. So don't be in a rush to get it all in one less session or a lecture. All right. Then I'm going to kind of finish off by talking about, since we're in the middle of a pandemic, of outbreak investigations. Outbreak investigations is not what we consider an epidemiological study design. Okay. I have done outbreak investigations myself in India, and I've published them. And I've done cross-sectional studies to investigate an outbreak. I have done cohort studies to investigate an outbreak. And I know people who've used a case control design to investigate an outbreak, right? So outbreak investigation inherently is not a design itself. An outbreak investigation is more a framework or a process of how you think about investigating an outbreak. And as part of the outbreak investigation, often people do cohort studies. They might do a case control study quickly. They might do a prevalence study. All sorts of things have to be done. They may have to do environmental investigations to see what is contaminated. So an outbreak investigation, think of it as a complicated, long process with multiple steps or processes. So here is a classic CDC diagram on how outbreak investigations are typically done. First, you have to detect the possible outbreak. Okay. Then you have to define what is a case for you. Okay. For you, the case definition could be influenza-like symptoms, or a case definition could be acute watery diarrhea, right? Or fever exceeding 7 days. Whatever it is, the investigating team has to nail down a definition and then go hunt for and find as many cases that match that description. Then by doing interviews, they can often generate some hypothesis. For example, typical outbreak investigation. A whole bunch of people have acute diarrhea. Okay. Now you do quick interviews to say, okay, where did you guys eat? Right? Oh, we all went to this party. Okay. And then we'll say, okay, what is this party? Who's at the party? What was served at the party? Was potato salad on the menu or not? Right? Was there chicken on the menu or not? You do all sorts of data collection, and then you start testing the hypothesis. Right? Say, are people who went to the party at much higher risk of developing diarrhea than those who skipped the party? Okay. Within those who went to the party are those who ate chicken biryani, eightfold higher odds ratio of developing diarrhea than those who skip chicken biryani, right? This is the kind of case control or cross-sectional analysis we end up doing. And then you got to go find the leftover chicken biryani, the leftover potato salad, send them off to the lab to see which of them is contaminated. Then the lab data comes back and say, okay, it was a chicken biryani that has this Vibrio cholera, okay, or some other pathogen, Salmonella typhi, right? Then you say, okay, now you go and refine the hypothesis, you find a link, then you actually do something to control the outbreak, right? If it's a restaurant that is continuing to sell chicken biryani with contaminated chicken supplier, then you go trace the source of the chicken, you go which farm the chicken came from, you go test the chicken there. That's how they investigate multi-state outbreaks of contaminated lettuce, contaminated milk, contaminated beef supply, and they track it and then they keep iterating it until they do it right. Okay. So outbreak investigations are not a specific study design, it's a process. Okay. That's the kind of stuff that happens. Now, all of you are wondering, okay, so what's an outbreak? What's a pandemic? What's an epidemic? So this is a beautiful illustration of what we mean by epidemic, endemic, outbreak, pandemic, and so on and so forth, right? Endemic disease is a condition that occurs at a steady expected rate in a given population. Now, defining the population is very important, right? For example, Kala Azar or visceral leishmaniasis is endemic in Bihar state in India. Okay, it is not endemic in Kerala or Tamil Nadu, right? So you just can't say what's endemic, what's not endemic, if you do not um, border your population of interest. You must say, in this particular district or state or region, this disease is endemic or not endemic. Like there are parts of India which is no malaria really. There are parts of India where malaria is a huge problem. Like Orissa, and is malaria has been a problem for decades, right? So endemicity is a constant level of disease occurrence year after year, month after month. It can fluctuate. It will fluctuate. There may be a seasonal pattern, but you know there is a baseline predicted level that every year in Orissa during this month we see about 2,000 cases of malaria plus minus 100. That's endemic, right? Could you have an outbreak above an endemic level? The answer is yes. So you know this is the fluctuating level of malaria for that season, for that space. Suddenly you found a twofold higher load of malaria. Then you say we now have an outbreak situation. This is way more than what we expect for that group, for that place, for that particular time, right? Now, even a single case, say of dengue hemorrhagic fever in Canada, we called an outbreak. It is not the number of cases, but the unusual pattern of where it should not be in the first place. Because there is zero dengue hemorrhagic fever happening in Canada, even one case or two cases or three cases will trigger an alarm for an outbreak investigation, right? So that is how you need to think about it. An outbreak is an unusual spike in the number of cases, way more than what is expected about the endemic levels for that place. An endemic level for Canada for dengue hemorrhagic fever is zero. So even one case is very unusual in Canada, will be investigated. Okay. Then, when the outbreak spreads and becomes more widespread even within a place, for example, it starts off in one district in Kerala. Now you have 8 districts in Kerala that has cholera. Then soon Tamil Nadu has cholera cases. Now you're talking about an epidemic. Okay, it has already spread to a larger area within a specific country or a region. The minute cholera pops up in Bangladesh, then in Nepal, then in Pakistan, then you see it in Indonesia, then you see it in Myanmar. Now you're saying, oh my God, cholera started off in some district in Kerala. It is now spreading across Southeast Asia. This is heading towards becoming a pandemic, right? Because of travel and whatnot, what started off in Wuhan became a pandemic globally. Every year, we could have a new strain of influenza running through the whole world. Starts off somewhere, soon you see it somewhere else, soon somewhere else, soon is somewhere else. Before you know, every case in every country in the world is reporting that strain of influenza. By that time, it's a pandemic. Now, in any outbreak, we one of the most basic things outbreak investigators do is to draw this thing called an epidemic curve, right? The x-axis is the actual calendar dates. Okay, December 30th, 13 January. So this is the outbreak, COVID global outbreak curve, right? Starts off somewhere. There's like one or two blips in December here, right? And then January is when it really starts taking off, right? And then by the time March arrives, you're really rocketing upwards, right? So the number of cases are given on the y-axis, the actual dates are given on the x-axis, and then you can then break it up by men versus women, adults versus children, which country they are in. You can use colored bars to indicate all of them, right? But if you added up all cases over a period of time, you get the total cumulative incidence. So there's a daily incidence. You keep on adding up every day's numbers, you get the total cumulative incidence. So the total cumulative incidence has crossed 4 million, right? But the daily incidence is less than that. Over a period of time, it accumulates. And these epidemic curves are very helpful to figure out things like incubation period, time of exposure, whether the curve is bending downwards, the curve is still trending upwards? Is it flattened? It's a useful thing to do in any epidemic, and it's like bread and butter. If you did a class on outbreak investigation, as I have, this is like bread and butter. We actually sit with a graph paper and learn to do it on our own by hand before the computers arrived. Okay, and one of the simplest thing you will compute in any outbreak is what we call an attack rate. Later on, you will learn when I speak in the next lecture that an attack rate is nothing but an incidence rate. Okay, attack rate is the same as incidence. It's just that it's called an attack rate in an outbreak context. Everywhere else, we will just say incidence. Okay, now what's an attack rate? Number of new cases of the disease during a specific time interval divided by people in the population at the start of the time interval, and people in the population must be at risk for getting that particular disease. New cases divided by the total cohort size from which the cases are coming up. Okay, that's called an incidence or an attack rate, right? So you could say attack rate is 2%, right? Which means 2% of the population has fallen ill with that particular disease. You go to a party, 100 people were at the party, 30 of them had diarrhea, attack rate is 30%. Okay, it's a simple proportion by the new cases divided by the total number of people who were exposed. And then you could use all of the information plus some mathematical models to compute this number called R naught. Okay, R naught is the basic reproduction number or a basic reproduction rate. It basically tells you how explosive a particular outbreak is, right? And it tells you how transmissible the virus or a bacterium or a pathogen really is, right? Like one of the most exquisitely, beautifully transmitting organisms ever known to humans is the measles virus. If you had one kid in a school with measles, you pretty much take it that every kid in the school will sooner or later be exposed to the virus because it jumps at an extraordinary level. Okay. The R naught for measles is a ridiculous 16, 17, 18. Okay. For COVID 19, most people think the R naught is somewhere between 2 and 3. What does that mean? If one person in a given population has COVID 19, they will likely infect 3 others. Those 3 people, in turn, each of them will infect 3 more people, right? And so this is why when an R naught is greater than 1, an epidemic will always trend upwards. There is no chance of an epidemic dying when an R naught is greater than 1 because every person is infecting another person. When the R naught is 2, it's like multiplying. When an R naught is something like 16, it's absolute pandemonium because each person will infect 16. Those 16 will infect 16. You do the math. This will double in triple in no time because that's how the explosive nature of the outbreak goes. Now, the reproductive number or R naught is the expected average number of secondary cases generated by one infected individual in a completely susceptible population. Completely susceptible means it's a virgin population where nobody's been exposed to that virus. Nobody's got prior immunity, nobody's been vaccinated, so the disease pretty much spreads like wildfire, right? In reality, people we know have varying levels of immunity. Some in measles, many people are vaccinated. The level of exposure levels is much lower. So we have a basic reproductive number, which is the ideal number in the absence of any resistance to that pathogen. But you have an effective reproductive number, which means you could have susceptible and resistant individuals in the population, vaccinated and unvaccinated. So the R, which is not R naught, R will typically be less than R naught. R naught is when nothing is stopping the virus from spreading. Now, a lot of confusion about what the R naught was for COVID in the early days, in part because you need good quality data to even nail this number down. And no one study gives you the R naught very well. A great example would be that cruise ship, right? You had one case in a cruise ship. The cruise ship is a contained box. Nobody's running away anywhere. And the virus spreads through the entire cruise ship. You can say from that one index case, 36 other people fell sick, right? So a cruise ship or a flight on which somebody sick got on are all kind of weird but contained experiments through which you can triangulate what the R naught might look like. But then a cruise ship is not a real life, right? Cruise ship, everybody is just sitting in a small boat in the middle of the ocean. So R naught in a real world might be different. So it depends on a lot of different factors. How big is the population? How dense is the population? Biological, environmental reason. And so it's a complicated modeling process. And although we like to ascribe that COVID has a fixed R naught, it doesn't. The R naught does change over time, right? Because the susceptibility levels are changing and people are doing things like physical distancing, which also changes the R naught. So it is not a number written in stone, is what I'd like you to remember. Okay. And the doubling time, like for example, on 20th April, Maharashtra had 200 COVID cases. On 25th April, the number of cases have jumped to 400. 200 became 400. That's doubled. And that occurred between 20th April and 25th April. So the doubling time is 5 days, right? The shorter the doubling time, the deadlier the transmission levels, right? In some countries right now, the doubling of cases is happening every 2 to 3 days. I mean, that is absolutely explosive. Versus in Canada now, we are probably doubling in about 24 days, right? And India, it's probably doubling at around 11 days, 10 days. So doubling time tells you how quickly things are going to explode, which is why people are a bit stunned that India had, I don't know, 20,000 cases a month ago. Now we have more than a lakh. Well, that's because it can double in as few as 10 days, right? So and Brazil is now absolutely going ballistic in its trajectory, right? Brazil will soon hit 1 million cases at the rate it's going because of the doubling time being so short. And once you reach 1 lakh, doubling it becomes 2 lakhs, 2 lakhs and becomes 4 lakhs. So the doubling will keep pushing the numbers to astronomical levels. And that's why a lot of people are simply not able to wrap their heads around how quickly this epidemic or pandemic is evolving over time. Herd immunity is another concept that all of you have been hearing about. It's all over the news media. There are articles written about what does herd immunity really means. I want to again go back to measles because measles is one of the most well-studied infectious disease pathogen that I know of, right? So even when I was a resident in Vellore in the early 1990s, I barely saw one or two or three cases of measles in my entire 3 years of MD training. Okay. In the 1990s, in Tamil Nadu, I barely saw 2 or 3 cases of measles in my entire 3 year training. And why is that? Because in that particular area, we had been giving measles vaccine again and again and again and again for years. Most babies in that district in Tamil Nadu had received a measles vaccine. The herd immunity was so good, so strong, that even if a child came in from somewhere else with measles, there are enough vaccinated kids around that kid to kill the transmission, right? The opportunities to infect someone is reduced if you're surrounded by people who've already been immunized, right? That's the concept of herd immunity. That is what a lot of people, especially those who don't believe in vaccines, don't understand. That this is not just a personal decision to accept a vaccine or not. Because if everybody declined the vaccine, the herd immunity in a population over a period of time plummets downwards. That leaves everybody in the population vulnerable. Then all you need is a new virus to introduce, and then it kind of explodes, which is why you see measles outbreaks in America right now, because the herd immunity is dropped, because a lot of people are refusing to get vaccinated, and then all you need is one case, and measles has an crazy R naught of 16, it'll just explode within a given population. Okay. So basically, you want a sufficient number of individuals to block transmission in a community. Now, what that number is depends on the disease. For example, measles, since it's got a ridiculous R naught and it's very easy to transmit, you have to have a very high level of herd immunity. If you had 50% of a population vaccinated for measles, forget it. You cannot prevent the measles outbreak. You need to start approaching 90% coverage with measles before you can have enough herd immunity. Now, what should the herd immunity be for COVID-19? You've seen numbers like 60% being thrown around, right? It's an estimate that if 60% of the population got COVID and recovered from COVID, and that recovery made them immune to COVID 19, then the transmission will start coming down. Or if there was the new COVID vaccine tomorrow, 60% of the world's population need to be vaccinated quickly to generate that level of herd immunity, then you start seeing a decline, right? So the R naught starts falling when you have more and more resistant people and less susceptible people. And you want to pull the R naught under one. The minute you get R naught under one, then the epidemic starts dying down. It may not die down immediately, but each person will infect less than 1%, and that person will infect less than 1%. Eventually, over enough cycles, you will start arriving close to zero. Okay, the last couple of thoughts before we wrap up this particular study design lecture. It's the question that you pose in an epidemiological study that dictates the study design. For example, if you ask me, Madhu, what is the best design to answer the question, is remdesivir a good drug for COVID-19? I would say with zero hesitation, a randomized control trial, right? Could I use observational studies on remdesivir? I could. Would it be a good design to answer the question? Absolutely not, because it's a minefield to figure out who got remdesivir, why they got remdesivir. People who are on remdesivir might be very different from people who are not on remdesivir. I will never ever be able to say with great certainty that remdesivir is or is not a good therapy unless it's an RCT. But then, if you ask me, Madhu, what's the best design for asbestos exposure and mesothelioma? I cannot say it's an RCT because I cannot randomize people to asbestosis exposure or not. I can only observe them. So I would then say maybe a cohort study or a well-designed case control study will get me to where I need to be, right? Sometimes a question is inherently diagnostic. If you say, what is the accuracy of a new COVID test? It is not a question of RCT, it's a question of doing a diagnostic study. So very few people teach you how to deconstruct a research question, okay? And this is very valuable, especially for students who are thinking how to do a systematic review or planning to design a study. And so generally we start with a very nebulous, fuzzy research question. That's a fine place to start. Then you start breaking it down into great specificity. Then the question becomes more and more soluble. Okay. For example, the vague question could be, does chloroquine improve outcomes of COVID patients? It's fine to start there. Then you got to make it way more specific than that. In adult patients with laboratory confirmed severe COVID-19 disease, does daily oral hydroxychloroquine lead to higher survival rates as compared to placebo? Now, this is an answerable question. The first question is way too fuzzy to answer. You need that level of specificity to be able to design a proper study. Okay, so in epidemiology, we teach our students to narrow the question with great specificity, leave nothing undefined. Then we have the ability to answer it. Broad, fuzzy questions are impossible to answer in real life research. Okay, so this is a nice rubric to think about. A focused review question: what's the architecture? You have to take a broad question, cut it up into 4 or 5 pieces, and then you have to piece them back together again. Then it becomes a focused question. Okay, PCO is how we think about it. P stands for who is the patient, what's the problem being addressed. I or E stands for what is the intervention or exposure that you care about. C, what is the comparison group that you care about? And O, what is the big outcome or endpoint that you care about? If your question does not define these PICO components, then it's a fuzzy question that cannot easily be answered. Okay. Now let me show you a couple of examples and then we close. Let's say I was to design a treatment question. I could start off with a vague question which says, is remdesivir effective for COVID-19? Okay. It's not good enough to do a trial, but it's an okay place to start. Then I have to cut it up. In adults with severe COVID-19, okay, adults with confirmed severe COVID-19, I have to then define what severe means, okay, that I have to do in my protocol. Adults, I have to define adults. Is it 18 plus, 15 plus age, severe, lab confirmed? All of them will need to be defined. But that's my patient or the problem I'm studying. Is intravenous remdesivir, right? How am I administering it? What is the drug? You could even say, is intravenous remdesivir for 10 days effective in reducing mortality? So I'm now fixing my outcome. Mortality could be different. Mortality could be hospitalization. Mortality could, the outcome could be ventilator versus not ventilated, right? It's up to me as an investigator to nail down my primary outcome on my endpoint. Okay, it's a choice that I make as an investigator. You might make a different choice, and that's fine. But I have to pick something, and I have to say this is my primary endpoint. As compared to what? As compared to hydroxychloroquine? Am I comparing remdesivir against chloroquine? I'm comparing remdesivir against lopinavir. Am I comparing remdesivir versus Tamiflu? What on earth is my comparison group? I need to define that. The minute I do all this, this becomes an answerable RCT question. If it's an etiological question, I might start off with a fuzzy question like, is smoking a risk factor for COVID? It's fuzzy, but then I could say, are adults who smoke regularly at greater risk of developing COVID-19 as compared to those who never smoke at all? Now that's an answerable question for which I might need to use a cohort or a case control study design. Okay, so the type of question dictates the study design that I end up choosing. So for each of the main domains, if it's disease prevalence, then I use a cross-sectional study. If it's etiology, I need case control or cohort. If it's treatment, RCT. If it's a prognosis study, who's going to die, cohort or an RCT. If it's harm, cohort or an RCT, case control. If it's diagnosis, then I could use a cross-sectional case control study or even an RCT. So it's the question that dictates the best design that I could use. Okay,